Rome burned it to the ground. Vikings tried to strangle it. The plague filled its streets with bodies. A fire ate the whole city in 4 days. The Luftwaffe dropped bombs on it for 57 nights in a row. And London is still here, not just standing, thriving, one of the richest, busiest, most visited cities on Earth, home to more than 9 million people, the beating financial heart of an entire continent, a city where a Roman road, a medieval church, and a glass skyscraper can sit on the same street. But none of that was guaranteed, not even close. 2,000 years ago, there was no London. There was no bridge, no crown, no cathedral. There was a river, wide, cold, unpredictable, cutting through mudflats and marsh at the edge of a damp island nobody in the civilized world cared much about. This is the story of how a patch of mud on the Thames became one of the most powerful cities that has ever existed, and how it got knocked down again and again and again and simply refused to stay down.
Welcome to Neovaria.
Long before the Romans ever set foot on this stretch of the Thames, the land here was almost useless for a city. Tidal marsh on one bank, dense woodland on the other, mudflats that could swallow a cart. Iron Age Britons lived nearby in scattered farms and hill forts, and they knew this stretch of river well. It was one of the few places wide enough for trade boats and shallow enough at low tide to be crossed on foot. That single fact, a river you could cross but only here, is the entire reason London exists. Whoever held this crossing point controlled everything that moved between the coast and the interior of Britain. Goods, soldiers, messages, power. The land itself was nothing special. The position was everything. In 43 A.D., the Roman army crossed the Channel and invaded Britain. Within a handful of years, Roman engineers had done what nobody local had bothered to do. They drove piles into the riverbed and built a proper bridge. On the north bank, right where that bridge met the road network, a settlement appeared. The Romans called it Londinium. It wasn't founded as a monument, it was founded as a machine. Londinium existed to move things, soldiers north into hostile territory, taxes back to Rome, and above all, cargo. Wine, olive oil, pottery, and slaves came in through the port. British tin, wool, and grain went out. Within 20 years, this river-crossing trading post had grown into the largest town in the province, bigger at its peak than the official Roman capital of Britain, Colchester. Growth like that draws attention, and in the year 60 or 61 A.D., it drew the wrong kind. Boudica was the queen of the Iceni, a British tribe in the east of the country. After Roman officials seized her land, flogged her, and assaulted her daughters, she raised an army and marched it straight at Rome's new towns. Colchester fell first, then Londinium. The Romans made a brutal calculation. The town wasn't defensible, so the governor evacuated it and let it burn. Boudica's forces massacred those who stayed behind and torched everything else. Archaeologists have actually found the evidence in the ground beneath modern London, a layer of scorched red clay and ash, sometimes over a foot thick, that marks the exact level where the first city died. Historians now just call it Boudica's red layer. London was less than 20 years old, and it had already been erased once. Rome rebuilt it, bigger, tougher, and this time in stone instead of timber. Over the following 2 centuries, Londinium got a forum and basilica the size of a cathedral, a governor's palace, public baths, an amphitheater that could seat around 7,000 people, and eventually a defensive wall nearly 2 miles around, some of which still stands today, tucked between office buildings near the Tower of London. At its height, somewhere between 20 and 60,000 people lived inside those walls, genuinely enormous for the ancient world. Then Rome itself started to fail. Legions were pulled back to defend the crumbling heart of the empire, and by around 410 A.D., the last Roman soldiers left Britain for good. Without an army, an administration, or organized trade, Londinium didn't get destroyed. It just quietly emptied out. The walls stayed standing over what was, for a while, essentially a ghost town. For roughly 200 years, the old Roman city sat mostly abandoned, while Anglo-Saxon settlers built a new separate trading town just upriver, which they called Londinium. It thrived quietly until the Vikings arrived. Norse raiders hit London repeatedly through the 800s, burning Lundinwick and terrorizing the coast. In 886 A.D., the Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great, the same Alfred remembered for holding the line against the Vikings across southern England, made a decisive move. He abandoned the exposed Saxon town and resettled everyone inside the old, defensible Roman walls. He rebuilt the fortifications, laid out a grid of streets that London still partly follows today, and turned the city into a fortress market that could survive a siege. For the first time since the Romans left, London had walls again, and it needed them. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crushed the English King Harold at the Battle of Hastings and marched on London. He was crowned King of England that Christmas Day in the newly built Westminster Abbey. But a crown alone wasn't enough to control a city this large and this wealthy. So William built something impossible to ignore: the White Tower, the stone keep at the heart of what we now call the Tower of London. It wasn't designed to be beautiful. It was 90 feet of solid Norman stone, deliberately placed at the edge of the city, and its message was unmistakable: resistance is pointless. It became a royal residence, a treasury, an armory, and eventually one of the most infamous prisons in English history. For the next several centuries, real power in London ran on this exact tension: the wealth of the merchants inside the city walls and the armed authority of the crown watching from just outside them. Medieval London was loud, filthy, and absolutely alive. Streets were unpaved and often ran with animal waste. Timber-framed houses leaned so close together that neighbors on opposite sides could practically shake hands out of their upper windows. And running through the middle of it all was the single strangest landmark in the city's history: London Bridge, rebuilt in stone starting in 1176, lined on both sides with shops, houses, and even a chapel, a functioning street suspended over the Thames that people were born, lived, and died on without ever setting foot on solid ground. The city's wealth kept growing, and with it, its leverage. In 1215, it was London's refusal to back King John. The city literally opened its gates to the rebel barons that helped force him to seal the Magna Carta, one of the first documents in history to put limits on a king's power. Long before it was a financial capital, London had already learned that money and crowds were their own kind of weapon. By 1665, roughly 500,000 people were crammed into a city built for a fraction of that number, with open sewage running in the streets and rats everywhere. That summer, bubonic plague tore through London. Officials nailed red crosses onto the doors of infected houses and sealed the families inside, alive with the sick and dying. Mass graves, plague pits, were dug on the edges of the city as the death carts made their nightly rounds. By the time it burned itself out, the Great Plague had killed roughly 1 in every 5 Londoners, around 100,000 people in a single year. London had barely begun to recover when the next disaster arrived, and this one came from inside a bakery. In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, A fire broke out at Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane. In any other city, it might have stayed small. In London, it was a death sentence. The streets were narrow, the houses were timber and pitch. They were packed edge to edge, and a strong east wind was blowing. The fire jumped from roof to roof faster than anyone could fight it. For 4 days, the Great Fire of London consumed the medieval city almost completely. Roughly 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the old Gothic St. Paul's Cathedral, its lead roof reportedly melting and running down the streets like water. Remarkably, official records list only a handful of deaths, though historians suspect the real toll among the city's poorest, undocumented residents was far higher. What rose from the ashes was a different London. The architect Christopher Wren redesigned dozens of churches in stone and brick instead of timber, and crowned the skyline with a new St. Paul's Cathedral. Its dome, when it was finished, was the tallest structure in London for over 200 years. The Great Fire had destroyed the medieval city. It also, by accident, forced London to finally stop building itself out of kindling. Over the following 2 centuries, London transformed again, from a rebuilt capital into the financial engine of a global empire. The Bank of England was founded in 1694. Lloyd's of London grew out of a coffeehouse where ship owners went to insure their cargo. The docks along the Thames expanded into some of the busiest in the world, unloading tea, sugar, cotton, and spices from ships that had crossed oceans. That wealth wasn't earned cleanly. It was built on colonization, forced labor, and the transatlantic slave trade, and London's rise as the financial capital of the world is inseparable from the empire's exploitation of the countries it controlled. The city grew rich because much of the planet was made to pay for it. The Industrial Revolution changed London's skin entirely. Factories, railways, and coal smoke turned the air thick and yellow. The infamous London pea souper fogs that writers like Charles Dickens described choking the streets. The population exploded past 2 million, then kept climbing, and the gap between the 2 Londons became impossible to ignore. Gas-lit townhouses and grand department stores a few streets away from overcrowded slums with no clean water at all. The city had gotten too big to move around on its own streets. So in 1863, London opened the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground passenger railway, built by digging a trench through the city and covering it back over. Steam locomotives hauled wooden carriages through tunnels thick with smoke and soot. It sounds almost unbearable today. At the time, it was a miracle of modern engineering, and it became the blueprint for nearly every subway system built afterward, anywhere in the world. The Victorians didn't just want London to be powerful. They wanted it to look powerful. After the old Palace of Westminster burned down in 1834, it was rebuilt as the Gothic masterpiece we know today, its clock tower topped by the bell known as Big Ben, first rung in 1859. Museums, train stations, bridges, and government buildings went up across the city in heavy stone, deliberately designed to project permanence and authority. London wasn't just running an empire anymore. It was performing one building at a time. Then came the 20th century, and with it, an enemy that could attack from the sky. Between September 1940 and May 1941, during what became known as the Blitz, Nazi Germany bombed London for 57 consecutive nights, and intermittently for months after that. Families slept on the platforms of the same underground stations built for Victorian commuters, using them as makeshift bomb shelters. Tens of thousands of Londoners were killed across the war, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. One image from that period became a symbol of the entire city. A photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's dome standing intact, and lit by fire, rising untouched above a sea of smoke and collapsing buildings around it. The building that had replaced a cathedral destroyed by fire in 1666 was now the proof that London, again, hadn't been beaten. Today's London barely resembles any single version of its own past. Glass towers like the Shard and the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf sit a short walk from Roman city walls, medieval churches, and Georgian townhouses. Beneath a modern office block in the financial district, you can walk down into the preserved remains of a Roman temple, the London Mithraeum, sitting exactly where Roman merchants left it nearly 2,000 years ago. Millions of people from every part of the world now call the city home, and it functions as one of the 2 or 3 most important financial centers on Earth. London never actually erased its own history. It just kept building new layers directly on top of the old ones. Roman stone under medieval streets under Victorian brick under glass and steel. Every layer is still down there if you know where to dig. Rome tried to make it disappear. Fire tried to burn it off the map. Plague tried to empty it out. Bombs tried to flatten it from the air. Every single time the city came back, not the same as before, but bigger, and somehow still itself. And it all started with nothing. No crown, no cathedral, no empire, just a river, some mud, and a place where a person could cross to the other side.